Welcome to the channel, everyone. On this channel, we share stories of average Joes around the world and their not so average issues. Let's start with the first story. I'm the reason my whole family blames and abuses my sister-in-law for her husband's death. Am I in the wrong? I'm a woman, 40 female, and I guess you can call this a confession of sorts. Based on the title, you probably already know what it's all about. Yeah, I may have done a thing. Let me tell you how this happened. In 2 words, COVID struck. Our family happened to be one of the many unlucky ones who became victims to the deadly new wave of coronavirus. Unfortunately, I lost 2 of my 5 brothers to the disease, one of whom I was closest to all my life. I'm not proud to say that I didn't take the news very well. We all latch onto our own coping mechanisms when it comes to coping with grief. Most of us try to project onto other reasons, and that's exactly what I did. Upon hearing of his death, I started to blame my brother's wife and hold her responsible for it instead of simply accepting what had happened. My reasons for this, however, were not unfounded. I'll begin by saying that my sister-in-law and I have never really gotten along. At the time my brother decided to marry her, I was already convinced that she didn't respect my brother, and it was far less than what he deserved. My family had a history of arranging marriages for their children, so their relationship was not born out of love, but rather necessity. I was really close to my brother, so I frequently visited him even after he started a family of his own. This is when I really started to resent my sister-in-law, as she would hound my brother to go on household errands for her while she stayed home and yelled at her kids and even me whenever she felt like it. She never made me feel welcome and would tell me to get out of her house under the claim that I was bothering the family and keeping my brother from work. All this was done behind his back, of course. A bitter woman, my sister-in-law never made much of an effort to get along with the family. We welcomed her and treated her as kindly as we did anyone, while the rest of the wives and relatives easily joined in and became one with the family. This sister-in-law rarely showed an inclination to do so. Nevertheless, my brother thought her a good wife and often defended her, citing that she was only cold because she was shy and did not know how to interact with the rest of us. He insisted that she was a different woman than we thought. Years passed like that. We tried to reach out to sister-in-law often for weddings, festivities, etc., but she only acknowledged us sometimes and turned down most of our invitations with excuses of work. And then she did the unthinkable. She took my brother away from me because her job had been transferred to another branch abroad. She insisted that it was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and that she would go by herself whether her husband decided to join her or not. Having grown up in a big family, my brother wasn't one to abandon his partner simply because their interests differed. He was used to adjustment. With a simple smile and a shrug, he said that he was ready to go. He would find another job over there. If possible, the hatred for my sister-in-law solidified tenfold after this incident. I was super attached to him, and she had basically ripped him away from me. Eventually, they returned, but they were not the same. Having been the first among all of us to live in another country, my sister-in-law had a newfound air of haughtiness and superiority. She made more money than most of us and made it a point to brag about herself whenever the family met up. She made us feel inferior about the schools we were sending our children to, the clothes we were wearing, our houses, our furniture, etc. It was an uncomfortable dynamic for all of us, especially so because she often joked about how she was the breadwinner of the family and the head of the house. She would call my brother useless for not having a stable office job like her, even though he left his stable job during the transfer so that she could keep hers in the first place. Anyway, family was family, so we mostly made peace with the fact that it was just her nature, and those of us that couldn't take it kept our distance. My brother, though, he was still down to earth and goofy like I remembered. He was the kind of person that could send an entire room into fits of laughter. But I noticed that he had become more closed off than usual. He had gotten tight-lipped about his feelings and rarely talked about his problems with us anymore. I found out the reason for this when I surprised him with a visit for his 36th birthday. My sister-in-law was bullying him. Well, bullying sounds like a schoolgirl way to put it, but what I mean to say is that she was basically taking every possible chance to harass him with all the slurs she knew. It didn't help that she had somehow turned their then teenage son against his father by playing good cop. She went to extreme lengths to ensure that it was my brother who forbade his son from pursuing the arts degree he wanted to, even though it was her that disapproved of it. Meanwhile, she would go behind my brother's back, coddle her son, and encourage his hatred for his father. So my cousin grew up sort of hating his dad, not knowing that it was actually his mother instigating the whole operation. She was the one who wanted him to stop his useless daydreaming and lecture him about getting a real education. When my brother refused to force another life onto his son, she would lash out at him with harsh remarks about how he might end up being good for nothing like his father. Since my brother dropped out of college early, sister-in-law often used this as ammunition against him. No doubt, years of taunting and teasing and verbal abuse took the spirit out of my brother. He had always been a gentle soul, but sister-in-law used this as a weakness and exploited it to keep him under her thumb. In the end, I remember my brother as nothing but a tired and lonely man who largely kept to himself, trying to make himself invisible. He did whatever his wife asked of him and bore his son's silent treatment for a long, long time. Even though some of his old self would return around us, his siblings and relatives, he would pull away as soon as he opened up. So yes, I hated my sister-in-law. It was because of her that I could do nothing but watch my loved one wither away as a person. Yes, I did try to talk to him about getting a divorce, but he insisted that their marriage wasn't a complete disaster. There was only so much any of us could do. My siblings and I were moving forward with our own lives and families. My sister-in-law and I continued to clash at family gatherings. She never left without taking a dig at me, and I never spoke to her unless it was to be passive-aggressive. It depresses me now to think that my brother spent a big part of his life being dull and sad in a home where he was hated by his own wife and son. When he was admitted into a hospital for COVID, I was told that it was a serious case. We all hoped and prayed for the best, of course, but COVID got the best of him and he passed away. After his death, all the anger from the previous years that I had kept suppressed finally caught up. I snooped around and talked to the rest of my family and found out that my sister-in-law and cousin had basically taken their things and left my father for good when he started showing symptoms of COVID. Sister-in-law did not even bother to check up on him or call any of us to keep us informed. When my brother knew it was getting bad, he called up a relative who lived close by to help him to the hospital. He could barely speak at that point. By the time he was admitted, the virus had taken over most of his body and he was having trouble breathing. Sister-in-law only came to visit him when she heard from the doctors that he was being put in the ICU unit and that chances of recovery were very slim. According to my relatives, she seemed to be in extreme shock and denial about the situation, and for once she wasn't making snarky comments at everyone. I, for one, initially chose to believe this was all an act. If sister-in-law was so anxious, she would have gotten him to a hospital sooner. Instead, she chose to watch him get sick and do nothing about it but save herself and her son. This was a new low. No one had ever confronted sister-in-law about her mistreatment of her brother up until now, and I would be doing him a disservice by not exposing her at least now. So that's what I did. I showed up to the funeral and told as many people as I could about her willful neglect and lifelong borderline abuse towards my brother. I wasn't the only one vibrating with fury. My siblings were just as enraged, and everything blew up when I finally confronted her and let out years of frustration right there at the ceremony. Confronting devolved into screaming and shouting on my part until sister-in-law is a mess of tears and sobs. Then I came to my senses and realized that I had publicly accused her of murdering my brother. What followed was all sorts of angry relatives coming up to curse at her, threaten her, and berate her for being a terrible human being. I don't feel bad about the confrontation, but here's the deal. It didn't occur to me until then that sister-in-law was going through her own strange form of grief. Yes, she had never been a good person to my brother, but I think that when you've lived with a person for years and years and raised a family with them despite all the differences, you would feel the loss severely even if you hated them. My sister-in-law had barely expressed an emotion, but in the 10 days between her husband's death and the funeral, she had lost an unreasonable amount of weight. She didn't speak a word that day, but had completely lost it when I started yelling at her. Though she had hurt my brother, I wonder if I took my resentment a bit too far by encouraging everyone to think she was the reason he was dead, leaving her with no support system at all. I feel even worse because I only just found out that the reason she had up and left without a second look when my brother caught COVID was that her own mother had passed away that very day. She just didn't say a word because she was not in the habit of sharing things with us. My distant relatives have taken to their phones to send us strongly worded hate messages, and sister-in-law now only has herself and her son to depend on. Do you think sister-in-law had this coming for everything she did? Or am I the one at fault for acting hastily? Is it worth it to reach out and try to mend our relationship even with my brother gone? Do you guys think I might be wasting a second chance on her considering the terrible person she's been so far? Am I in the wrong for getting my nephew a gift he really wanted for Christmas, though his mother said no? I'm a single 27 male with no partner or child who has been quite successful in his career. I'm not trying to boast, just pointing out the fact that I'm lonely and have no one to splurge my money on, lol. With nowhere to go this Christmas, I decided to accept my older sister's gracious invitation to spend the night at her house. My sister has a 14-year-old son who recently graduated middle school. I wasn't able to attend his graduation earlier that year due to a work trip, but I wanted to congratulate him with something special. I'm not trying to be mean, but my nephew is a little bit of a nerd. He almost always has his nose buried in a book, and my sister is always bragging about his excellent grades and academic achievements. We're all very proud of him, but I've always felt that the poor boy is a bit too pressured for his age. You see, my sister is a perfectionist and she's always reminding my nephew that getting top grades and excelling at school is a must. Yeah, she's one of those mothers who wants their children to be number one in everything and will not tolerate it if disappointed. I'm not a fan of her parenting, but I try not to make this obvious as past attempts to do so have earned me some mean glares and harsh words. So when I texted my nephew Al asking him if there was anything specific he wanted, I was taken aback when he eagerly replied with PlayStation. I was expecting him to name a book or something since that was basically what he was conditioned to do. So I was pleasantly surprised, but I figured, hey, he is a growing boy. He's going to start having his own likes and dislikes separate from his mother now. And what the hell for the prodigy he's been so far? The boy at least deserves a PlayStation. It's every teenager's dream. So that's exactly what I got him. Come Christmas Eve, I tell my sister Maggie about the PlayStation and I'm expecting her to laugh and thank me. But instead, she just says, no. I ask her what she means by that and she explains that her son is not allowed to have a PlayStation, comics, TV shows or any such typical entertainment as it will distract him from his life goals. I tell her she's being ridiculous. She gets angry and exclaims that I'm just like her husband and that nobody in this house sees that she's looking out for her son's future. I try to remind her that the boy is 14. Let him live. But she coolly tells me to shut up and put my gift back in the car before I ruin Christmas. I'm not allowed to give Al a PlayStation, and that's final. It might have been final for her, but not for me. Al was going to get his PlayStation whether Maggie liked it or not. Except the moment I brought out the PlayStation, Maggie exploded and tried to snatch it out of my hands. She started yelling that she wouldn't allow Al to have a PlayStation because he had to focus on school. Once she said these words, her husband got furious too, but not at me. He in turn started yelling at my sister. It turns out that Maggie and her husband had been in disagreement about Al's life priorities for a while now, and my brother-in-law was understandably worried that Maggie was ruining their son's childhood. The PlayStation happened to be the trigger, as it led to a huge argument between the parents. One fight led to another as other issues in the marriage started to come up, and somewhere in between the PlayStation ended up smashed against a wall and everything was a mess in general. Looking at Al, observing the scene with some fear and a lot of sadness, I realized that I both ruined my nephew's Christmas and his present and his parents' relationship. I suppose I'm partly responsible for setting off the argument that led to their temporary split from each other. Maggie and her husband are now living separately and sharing Al between them on weekdays, weekend basis. It's not a divorce, but they have a lot of buried problems to work on. The person I'm worried for the most is Al, who doesn't seem to be taking the situation very well. His mom and dad use him as a kind of competition, one of them spoiling him, rotten with all the childhood fun he had missed out on, and the other still grueling him about maintaining a Star Trek academic record. I know that all their issues coming up at some point was inevitable, but I can't help thinking that if I hadn't caused a scene that night, Al would not be in this position today. We hope you enjoyed today's stories. Use the comment section below to state your verdict on the situation, express your opinions, and share some valuable advice.